And let me tell you my own personal theory for why conservatives make bad art. It's because conservatives are dumb. It's because they're dumb. Because that's not the only reason they're stupid. It's because they're dumb guys. As a video essayist, I generally act as if there's a way of interpreting media properly. In fact, I basically do think there's correct and incorrect ways of interpreting media and try to interpret it correctly. I mean, that should be my job, right? The reality is, if you want guidance on how to feel good, just do popular stuff that makes people like you more. You hated yourself, everyone hated you, and you hated yourself. You were lame and everyone hated you. And that's the truth. Because you sucked. Because you sucked then.
What is art? Art is a piece of work made through creative expression. Music, sculptures, movies, and so on seek to express something, whatever that might be. Then an audience can have any number of interpretations of that art. Interpretation is how we consume, evaluate, and enjoy creative works. Music is made to be listened to, cuisine is prepared to be tasted, and movies are made to be watched. Our experience of a piece of art comes from our interpretation, how it sounded to us, how it tasted, how it looked, or how it made us feel. This experience itself can be enough to influence or inspire us. Then public discourse takes place. We compare our personal experiences to each other's in regards to a particular piece of work. Sometimes only one interpretation of a piece of art is commonly expressed, which can still lead to conversation. But if there are two or more common and opposing interpretations of something like a film, that can really draw attention. This attention can lead to buzz and/or influence. In this context, buzz refers to using attention for marketing and financial purposes, while influence refers to using attention for ideological and political reasons. Since both require attention, buzz and influence often overlap. Sometimes a person or a group cares more about the impact of the art they're making more than the work itself. We'll call this a meta bypass, when someone prioritizes buzz, influence, and the dynamics of public discourse before artistry and expression. A non-political example of this would be the infamous art piece Comedian, which is simply a banana duct taped to a wall. The point of the piece isn't to be aesthetically pleasing to the eye. It's sort of a symbol of the conversation it invites about postmodernism. It's lazy, sure, but that's part of the reason why so many people talk about it. Some will lambaste it due to its absurdity and simplicity. Others will praise and defend it for how much it was able to accomplish, considering how little it's working with, and that's the point. The comedian puts the conversation about itself before the piece of work alone. It prioritizes buzz. It's important to point to this as an example because the concept of a meta bypass isn't inherently problematic. An interest in how the public perceives and talks about art can result in genuine creative expression. A more fitting example for this video is one Big Joel points out: Lady Ballers, made by the Daily Wire. This movie would be considered a comedy, although it's clear that it puts its marketing and political goals before getting a laugh. It seeks both buzz and influence, calling itself the most triggering comedy of 2023, buzz, and taking a controversial yet decidedly conservative stance on trans people in sports, influence. The two common interpretations are intended and manufactured. People on the left will generally find the movie offensive and harmful, while those on the right are intended to feel that their beliefs have been justified. The divisive direction of the film is the marketing in and of itself. It comes off not as a genuine creative expression, but rather merely means to an end. This would be considered pandering, grifting, or manipulation, and the result is a complete lack of creative expression. This is all worthy of analysis and conversation, which ultimately leads to new narratives, new media, new art. This is what this video is about, and we'll be looking at Big Joel's YouTube channel to explore these ideas. So, who is Big Joel? Big Joel is what you would call a breadtuber. Breadtube is a term that became popular around 2016, used to describe a political side of YouTube that makes leftist content. I'm not sure how relevant the term breadtube is nowadays, but I digress. Joel makes video essays, usually about media and politics from a progressive perspective. We'll look at some of his content more closely in a moment. Review and analysis can lead to influence in public discourse itself. It's also an extension of public discourse from the original piece of art. An extension which, given the right circumstances, can become more culturally significant than the piece of work itself. For example, the reviews of Cool Cat Saves the Kids were far more popular, successful, and respected than the actual movie. I do think it's important to talk about the the influence of media. If you've been watching this channel, you probably know that it's something that I'm particularly interested in. Though in the case of Gamergate, I'm talking 2016 Gamergate, not the more recent Sweet Baby Inc. or Stellar Blade stuff, the conversation about politics in video games became more politically charged and toxic than the video games themselves. I know this discourse is beyond tired, but it's important to look back upon in order to understand Joel's approach to media. In 2019, he made a video reflecting on this cultural conversation, Anita Sarkeesian and the people who hate her. For those who aren't familiar with Gamergate and its driving conflict, I'll put it in a nutshell. A feminist named Anita Sarkeesian made video game analysis from a progressive perspective. Many people had a problem with her overt political messaging, most notably Sargon of Akkad. This created a political dichotomy in the gaming world between the left, Anita and those concerned with traditional themes in video games, and the right, Sargon and those who think this concern is unwarranted. Sargon wound up becoming a controversial political figure himself, and if you're curious about that, I recommend watching Porcelain's video on him. For the sake of this video, that's all that's really important for now. That Gamergate was centered around a political discussion about the influence of video games. As Joel states at the start of his video, he is firmly siding with Anita and the internet left.
I side firmly with the internet left on this issue. I genuinely like Anita Sarkeesian. I agree with lots of her points and thought she was pretty cool before I knew she was somebody who everybody hated.
For the sake of transparency, here's my opinion of Gamergate. I think that both Anita and Sargon wound up over-politicizing what could have been a more collected, interesting, and perhaps even productive conversation about the influence of video games. In this regard, I don't think Joel's video helps, nor is it intended to, although with the way he phrases things, you might be led to believe otherwise.
This video isn't about condemning the people who hated on or harassed Sarkeesian, nor is it a defense of her work. I mean, don't get me wrong, lots of the stuff I say here will be related to both of those things, but they're not really the point. No, this video is about one thing. It's about the way that art is interpreted and about how it's given meaning.
His video does talk about art, its interpretation, and its meaning, but it becomes clear that defending Anita is far more important to him than a true understanding of media. Something that Joel focuses on in this video is cultivation theory and the arguments against it. According to Wikipedia, cultivation theory states that individuals who invest more time in watching television are prone to perceive the real world through a lens aligning with the prevalent depictions in television messages, in contrast to their counterparts with lower television viewership but comparable demographic profiles. I wasn't familiar with the term cultivation theory before making this video, although I do believe that the media we consume and our relationship to that media can have a significant impact on what we believe and how we behave. As I said in my video on mass hysteria, we are far more subject to influence than we'd like to believe. The counter to this was, well, if video games have a negative impact on people's behavior, then surely we would see evidence of this in crime statistics.
And after the game Burnout was released, you would have expected to have seen a dramatic increase in the number of people trying to cause as much damage as possible in a car wreck. And we didn't.
And I do think this is kind of a silly point to make. Crime statistics are hardly a way to determine whether or not media is having any sort of impact on how people behave. Joel counters this point somewhat reasonably.
I don't think that science is actually capable of disproving obvious facts about the way people work. Media's ability to cultivate behaviors, emotions, and dispositions isn't some incidental point about it that requires further proof. Rather, it's the entire reason why media exists in the first place. People seek out art to be affected by it, to learn things or feel things. People make art to give others those experiences, to connect with their audience or persuade them or whatever. Media is cultivation.
I say somewhat reasonably because even though I agree with what he's saying, what we're talking about here is Super Mario Bros. And Double Dragon. I mean, sure, you could say that people seek to be affected by Mario because it's fun, and that fun is having an effect, but in the context of this video, he makes it sound like all of media is for the purpose of changing our perception of the world. A majority of media never makes an impact at all though, and most popular media is consumed for the sake of comfort and entertainment entertainment, not to have a set of beliefs changed or to be affected by it. It is made simply as an expression, not as a tool for change. Yes, I understand that media can be influential, but let's not act like the reason people play Mario is for the traditional gender roles or a celebration of the patriarchy. People play Mario because Nintendo understands what makes movement in a video game fun. Most of the time, people make video games for them to be played and understood as video games, not as political narratives.
So is this game a story about social structures? Well, maybe. I mean, I kinda like that idea. But no matter what, it's also a story about dudes getting and exerting power. One that's facilitated through women losing power.
As someone who played plenty of Mario growing up and still plays some Mario from time to time, I can talk about what kind of behavior and discussion I saw Mario cultivating, anecdotally speaking. Dude, riding the shells in Mario 64 is awesome. It makes Lethal Lava Land feel like a skate park. What Mario game do you think has the best soundtrack? I think it's Odyssey. Man, Sunshine had such good movement, it's a shame that the level design isn't consistent. Does Mario Wonder really rival Super Mario World for best 2D Mario game? I need to play that shit. Fans of Mario don't care about the story or narrative of Mario because Mario isn't really about saving a princess. It's about movement, it's about platforming, it's about level design. It's not about a male power fantasy. Writing a story and making a game are two very different things. When we look at video games as games instead of political narratives, Joel and Anita's kind of political analysis starts to fall apart. Like, what about board games? That's a form of entertainment that could be more politically influential than we realize. I mean, in the board game Sorry, you move your pieces clockwise, a sentimental and favorable treatment of traditionalism. Not only that, but when you bump into other players, their status within the game is brought back to rock bottom. The game is encouraging violence as a means to get ahead. Sure, many will say sorry when they commit such an act, but the game still rewards them for their aggressive and oppressive playstyle. Lastly, the entire game is about competition and hierarchy. Can you think of a more flagrantly capitalist theme than that? It's almost as bigoted and fascist as Monopoly. Joel doesn't recognize that video games are generally closer to toys or sports than cinema or video essays. This isn't about my view of video games, though. This is about a contradiction that Joel makes in his video. He made his case for the influence and impact of media, which makes sense. I agree with the notion that you don't need science to prove that storytelling, art, and media are all meaningful parts of humanity. I just think he's grossly overstating the political influence of video games. Here's the contradiction. For context, he's countering the opposing argument to cultivation theory again.
Now, I can honestly see why this argument was compelling to people. It seems to make a lot of sense, right? If you want to say that art is bad, you gotta make sure that it causes bad stuff to happen. But even though I'm sympathetic to the people who bought into this logic, it is still, as far as I'm concerned, terrible logic. And that's for one reason. When people say that art has destructive or toxic messages, they are almost never referring to the literal destructive impact that the art had on the real world.
This is a complete contradiction of his claim that media is incredibly influential and cultivates behaviors, and that's the point of media, and so on. I think there are arguments to be made for both sides, but this is the exact opposite of what he was just saying. Yes, when people talk about media being problematic, harmful, or dangerous, they are often referring to the impact it's had or could possibly have. To explore this idea further, let's talk about Lübenschluben.
Let's do a little thought experiment. Say a film is made that is unabashedly Nazi propaganda. Let's call it Lübenschluben.
YouTube doesn't like it when my videos contain the N-word, so I'll summarize. Lübenschluben is a hypothetical film that is unironically and unabashedly fascist. It's made in a horribly hateful fashion to the point where general audiences are incapable of accepting any of the film's messaging. There are some people who enjoy the movie, but those people were already hateful fascists who couldn't be convinced to be any more spiteful. Joel makes this assessment of his hypothetical.
It's not bad because somebody might become a Nazi when they see it. No, it's bad because it advocates bad things.
This example doesn't really work at all. First of all, Joel's video is supposed to be about art, its interpretation, how that art is given meaning, the influential weight of media, and how it cultivates behaviors. Here, however, he conjures up an exceptionally hateful yet somehow uninfluential example to make a point about how when people say art is harmful or dangerous, they're not talking about any kind of real-world impact. So, is media so influential that it's worth discussion and concern, or is harmful media incapable of being harmful? Why bother using such charged and over-the-top language if there's not really a threat? Second of all, if Lubin Schlubin was released in the real world, then yes, people would condemn it for its messaging, and the reason why they would condemn that messaging is because they're worried about the impact on society it's either having or could potentially have. It may not convince outright fascists to be any more hateful, but it could encourage those people to form communities based on hate and to better organize their efforts. In the real world, Lubin Schlubin has the capacity to be influential, and it doesn't even make sense for Joel to argue otherwise. The rest of his video is making the argument for the influence of media, not against it. So this argument about when people say art is harmful, they're almost never talking about a real-world impact is in contradiction to the rest of his video. Of course, when he and Anita talk about the damsel in distress trope of Mario being problematic, they're talking about the influence it did or could have had on our society. They're talking about the behaviors that media cultivates and how that can be problematic. They're talking about what's politically at stake in video games.
Anita isn't just here to make a bunch of neutral statements about what video games are like. She wants to say that video games have some relationship to things like sexism, misogyny, the patriarchy, negative and pervasive stuff she sees in our culture.
Obviously, both Anita and Joel think that video games can influence society negatively. Then what's the point of this contradiction? Is it just an honest mistake? Maybe, but I don't think so. This contradiction serves a function. It allows Joel and Anita to vaguely allude to problems that could or might be happening by using charged over-the-top rhetoric without any kind of evidence. They're not saying anything explicit about the influence of media, just using progressive buzzwords and calling things problematic or harmful. This way, they can invoke fear and support before knowing if there's even a problem. This isn't about interpreting art or what makes art meaningful. This is about using media as ammunition to fight for a political cause. But because they claim to not be referring to any real-world impact, they can be much more brazen with their positions. It allows them to imply danger and harm without having to prove that any danger or harm is present. It allows them to push a political agenda whenever they merely feel offended by art. It allows them to substitute the actual influence a piece of art had with their personal, overly political interpretation of that art.
She didn't wait for the Double Dragon studies to come in and prove that the game causes regressive behaviors. And of course she didn't do that, because she doesn't have to. She is a person who experienced this work of art, and she's claiming here that what she saw in it was bad. When Anita Sarkeesian sees these things in society, she thinks they're awful problems. And for that reason, and that reason alone, she also thinks they're awful when advocated for in media.
This wasn't Anita's or Joel's argument, though. They both believe that media is influential and cultivates behaviors. Their argumentation goes well beyond, I see bad thing, therefore bad thing bad. The bad thing means something to them, and they believe it means something to its audience, that the primary function of media is to affect people. Yet, at the same time, Lubin Schlubin isn't capable of influencing anyone in Joel's eyes. Anita and Joel have positioned themselves in such a way so they never need to prove what they're saying. They might identify some traditional male-centric themes in video games, but they don't tell us why or how that's causing a problem. For much of their audience, labeling a piece of media as traditional, male-centric, or harmful to women is all they need to hear to agree. Joel doesn't need to prove that a piece of media is harmful to women in order to label it as such, because he claims that, in this context, the word harmful has nothing to do with actual harm. It's incredibly misleading and deceptive. He does say the quiet part out loud, though.
She's a feminist who wants various things about games to change, and they disagree with her vehemently about it. These guys are unapologetically anti-feminist, and because of that, they see no reason to change media to make it more feminist.
They want the power to influence art for ideological reasons. They want to change the way people express themselves in order to satisfy their political agenda. The only proof they need to advocate for this change is their subjective subjective interpretation, not how the art has had an objective impact. They still allude to the potential influence and danger of video games by using charged language, but when it comes time to speak more explicitly about said influence, they retreat to their interpretation where nothing needs to be proven. If the question they were asking was, what kind of media cultivates misogyny, they'd be talking about adult entertainment and how accessible it's become to children. If the question they were asking was, what kind of behavior do video games cultivate, they'd be talking about video game addiction and a lack of discipline. But these aren't the questions they're asking. To me, it seems the question they're asking is, how can we shoehorn our politics into media analysis? Joel's video is not made for the understanding of media like he says. It's made solely to defend Anita and to condemn her critics. Anita Sarkeesian normalized turning video game analysis into a cultural and political battleground. This is why so many people despise her, and it's also the reason why Joel genuinely likes her content. When it comes down to it, their analysis is about asserting power and moral superiority. They don't really care about the themes in Mario or Double Dragon. They care about controlling the influence that this conversation itself can have.
What are these arguments here to do? What do they want from us? And the answer is simple. These arguments whittle away at our ability to interact with media as media, because people like these use arguments like the ones we've talked about to try to control your mind, intentionally or unintentionally. They are alienating you from one of the most fundamental things about being a human, your ability to understand and interpret art as a person who lives in our culture.
I wouldn't blame you for thinking Joel is talking about himself here. Not only is this conclusion hypocritical in the context of this video, it's hypocritical in the context of Big Joel's YouTube channel. This video is over 5 years old, and many of the problems in this video are problems that can be found in his most recent uploads. It is important to understand what kind of effect media can have on us, but approaching this topic from a politics-first perspective only makes the influence of media tougher to navigate. It should be said that doing this without error is difficult. I'm just not convinced that the problems with Joel's content can be written off as accidental. These errors seem too convenient and routine to be considered honest mistakes. For example, the problem of politicizing non-political media is perfectly demonstrated in Big Joel's video, The Conservative Propaganda of Dr. Phil. Before we go any further, I should address a certain claim that everything is political. Sure, you can interpret anything as political, just as I can go to a museum, lick some statues, and write an essay about what that means to the world of fine dining. Just because objects have a taste and texture doesn't mean I should run around putting everything in my mouth. There's a debate to be had about when political analysis is or isn't appropriate, and in my opinion, Joel's criticisms of Dr. Phil are inappropriate and unproductive at best. I'm not that familiar with Dr. Phil, and maybe there is a case to be made about his politics and how he presents them in his show. Joel's argumentation is incredibly weak, though, and it doesn't convince me of anything regarding Dr. Phil's politics. If anything, this video makes me more skeptical of Joel, not Phil. Much of Joel's video focuses on Boomer the dog, someone who, as you may have guessed, dresses up as a dog and identifies as such in some kind of way. They don't have a job, they've never dated at the age of 48, and they don't seem to have any kind of responsibilities. Their entire life appears to be centered around role-playing as a dog.
As Phil is pressing him on his lack of life experiences, his ostensibly avoidant behaviors, they have this interaction.
Yeah, well, I feel it's a good compromise for me. I mean, it's kind of a compromise to be both a dog and a human in a way, but
yeah, beats working, right?
This line that Phil says here, well, beats workin', is one of the most fascinating and revealing things I've seen on this show.
It's a very short line, beats working, right? So what does this line reveal? Joel tries to convince us that it's revealing a conservative agenda, that a conservative agenda is the entire point of the show.
This intuitive relationship between problem and solution, you're too fat, so be less fat, functions to give Dr. Phil a lot of power. It conceals a pattern of underlying assumptions that pervade this show and allow Phil to pursue a very particular ideological project. He is doing something here, trying to get us to believe something about his narrow conception of personal responsibility and about what normal looks like and how it must be maintained. These ideas must come through, no matter what. It is the point of the work.
Let's look at Joel's perspective of work throughout his video. One of his main points against Dr. Phil is how the concept of work is treated.
Boomer certainly does prefer to do this dog thing than to do labor that's productive for capital. Your bootstraps haven't been pulled, and considering that, you should probably pull them.
This is just silly from both a political and a therapeutic standpoint. The way Joel chooses to phrase work as labor for capital and pulling up your bootstraps in his video titled The Conservative Propaganda of Dr. Phil is unnecessarily politically charged. It's ridiculous to imply that the importance of work is an exclusively right-wing sentiment. Every functioning society needs people who are willing and able to work and provide. Hell, even communism extols the idea of work and labor, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. Karl Marx. Boomer the dog would not be allowed to exist as such in a communist country. They would be put to work, and let's not pretend otherwise. The importance of work is not exclusive to any political ideology and goes far beyond the realms of politics. As someone who advocates for personal responsibility and self-sufficiency, I don't like to use the phrase pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Too many people see it as either patronizing or having some kind of conservative connotation. A phrase I do like to use, however, is give yourself a fighting chance. It recognizes that there are many circumstances that are out of our control, and we often aren't in such a favorable position. However, even in a dire situation, it's best to focus on what's in our control and to try to increase our odds of a favorable outcome. The phrase pull yourself up by the bootstraps implies that you are dealing with a personal failure and nothing else. The phrase give yourself a fighting chance implies that the world isn't perfect or fair, but it's best to try in spite of that. Just like Joel, I'm no medical expert, but there's tons of literature and research that proves that work, purpose, and direction are vital to our mental health and self-image. Books like Mastery, Dopamine Nation, and Psycho-Cybernetics have helped millions of people understand the relationship between happiness, fulfillment, purpose, and effort. It's perfectly reasonable for a therapist to ask questions about habits, lifestyle, and work ethic, especially before any kind of diagnosis is made. A lack of work and direction can lead to a great deal of mental strain. It's important to understand if that's the case or not before getting a psychiatrist and medication involved. This isn't to say that I think Dr. Phil's show is the epitome of medical ethics or anything like that. It's a daytime pop psychology reality mess that's reminiscent of Maury and Jerry Springer. There are bound to be some problems worthy of criticism. With that said, I don't think Dr. Phil wants to cross the line of diagnosing people's mental illnesses in front of a live audience. As unhelpful and vapid the show can be at times, there are still some boundaries. There are thousands of episodes of Dr. Phil that I haven't seen, so maybe they are more willing to diagnose on set than I realize. Either way, to frame any of this as some kind of secret conservative ideological project spearheaded by Dr. Phil and CBS is insanity. To Joel, however, this is evidence of Dr. Phil stacking the deck for political reasons.
Dr. Phil chose the problem. He's stacking the deck.
Once again, I think this focus on lifestyle and productivity is for ethical, legal, and liability purposes, not something that indicates a political agenda. This is one of Joel's main arguments, but it's not the only one. A segment of Dr. Phil that Joel says cements his case is the segment with Diamond.
One last really simple example, one that kinda cements my case. A conversation between Phil and a girl named Diamond. Diamond is a trans woman who's been acting out. Her family and mother think she's manipulative, toxic, attention-seeking, entitled, etc. The interesting thing, though, is Diamond's brother, Mitch. Mitch is pretty aggressively transphobic. He claims that he doesn't have any kind of problem with Diamond transitioning, but he absolutely refuses to gender her properly.
He believes that because Dr. Phil had a trans person on and didn't dig into their transition or their brother's misgendering enough, his claim of conservative propaganda is confirmed. That's it. Here's the problem with this. Would Joel or his audience consider Dr. Phil as someone who is qualified to analyze anyone's personal transition story in front of a live audience? I have my doubts on that, so we have a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situation. If Dr. Phil really dug deep on Diamond's transition, he'd risk people on the left thinking his analysis was inappropriate, maybe invasive or insensitive, and ultimately problematic. He'd also risk people on the right thinking he's overly sympathetic to the trans community. If Dr. Phil doesn't talk about it much, which he didn't, then someone like Big Joel might still come to the conclusion conclusion that he's politically problematic. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. What I see is a show that wants elements of drama while still appealing to a wide audience. They don't want to offend either side of the aisle, so Dr. Phil takes an apolitical non-approach to politically divisive topics, but they still include these topics for publicity and buzz. I don't think this diamond example cements Joel's case of Dr. Phil being conservative propaganda. He even includes a clip of Phil talking about trans people favorably.
Phil doesn't explicitly say awful things about trans people. He seems to have okay beliefs about them.
Thereby, as some people have described it, defining transgender individuals out of existence.
Where does that come from? You think just, I'm going to change the word, I'm going to take that out of the dictionary, and these people seek to exist? Kiss my ass, you can't do that.
So there's not really anything to learn from the diamond segment, at least not in terms of Dr. Phil's politics. There are some other examples that Joel uses, but they all relate to at least one of the arguments I've already brought up. The three main points of Joel's video are: the entire point of Dr. Phil is conservative messaging, Phil's segment on Diamond didn't focus on trans issues enough, and Phil puts too much emphasis on work ethic and purpose instead of mental illness. But it makes sense for a therapist to care about your work ethic. It makes sense to avoid diagnosing mental illness on daytime television, and it makes sense that Dr. Phil wouldn't want to walk on the eggshells of trans issues. Most importantly, I don't see Dr. Phil as a show that does more than it's saying through political messaging. In fact, I see it as the exact opposite. Dr. Phil is a show that presents itself as helpful and insightful when it's usually a rather hollow effort. Dr. Phil's show isn't doing more than it would have you believe, it does less.
It conceals a pattern of underlying assumptions that pervade this show and allow Phil to pursue a very particular ideological project.
Then what are the underlying assumptions of Dr. Phil's audience? That work and personal responsibility are good? How exactly is an ideological project being pursued here? Joel does his best to provide some kind of answer, but the effort is futile. He's looking for an answer that doesn't exist. There is a pattern of underlying assumptions that pervade Joel's channel and allow him to pursue a very particular ideological project. He is doing something here, trying to get us to believe something. He's telling us about how people should and shouldn't view media, about how emphasizing the importance of work is a toxic way of laundering conservative messaging. Joel is guilty of the very things he accuses Dr. Phil of. He misrepresents a show seeking buzz as something seeking political influence. Through Joel's own analysis, though, it's clear that he's the one seeking political influence. The line "beats working right" doesn't wind up being nearly as illuminating as Joel makes it out to be. No matter how Joel might represent it, work ethic and a sense of purpose are vital to our mental health, and recognizing that isn't a conservative dog whistle, it's just true. Alright, what about Joel, his audience, and their underlying assumptions?
Hey everybody, so if you've been on left-leaning segments of the internet for any time at all, you know that one weirdly recurrent theme, something that comes up again and again, is liberals and leftists trying to explain why conservatives aren't funny and why conservatives make bad art. While I do think that capital C conservative art is quite a lot worse than most other kinds of art, I don't think that punching down or lack of empathy are the reasons for that. And let me tell you my own personal theory for why conservatives make bad art. It's because conservatives are dumb. It's because they're dumb. It's because they're dumb guys. If you're watching a comic and the comic says a dumb thing, you're way more likely to not find that comedian funny, because they're stupid.
The underlying assumption between Joel and his audience is that all conservatives are dumb, stupid, bad people who hate minorities.
As I'm editing this video, I'm imagining that I'm going to get one comment. Yes, Big Joel, I agree with you that conservatives stupid and that's probably why their art's not very good. But the reason they're stupid is because they're always punching down and hate minorities. And I would say yes, because that's not the only reason they're stupid. Most conservative beliefs are stupid.
The delivery seems comical, and there is an element of humor here, but the joke is that he's presenting his simple explanation as a new mind-blowing theory, not that he doesn't believe what he's saying. This isn't sarcasm, although it might seem like it to those not familiar with his content. His audience takes this explanation at face value. I feel so validated. I've always known conservative beliefs are inherently stupid, but I feel like nobody's willing to come out and just say that. Yeah, Joel's really brave for that one. Come on! Normally, I'm not one to dig through comments to prove a point about another creator because you can't control what people think or say about your content. But there's no room for misinterpretation here. Joel is telling his audience that conservatives are dumb and largely incapable of making art, and they agree.
I prefer an explanation concerning the stupidity of conservative beliefs, because this whole empathy punching down thing just seems like a way of asserting like a liberal conscience superiority.
Let's get this straight. Some say that one of the things that make conservatives worse at art than leftists is that they like punching down, and even though Joel agrees with this, he doesn't like this argument because it comes off as morally superior, so instead he asserts intellectual superiority through mockery and punching down on those he views as dumber than him. This is the kind of next-level political gymnastics we're dealing with here. This video came out about 4 months before his much longer video on conservative comedy. Conservative comedy ruined my life. He has 2 different channels, Big Joel and Little Joel. The former uploads video essays and the latter uploads short rants and whatnot. Looking at the timing of his uploads, I think it's a safe assumption to say that the Little Joel video on conservative comedy led to him making a much more fleshed out video on his main channel. Let's start looking into that video.
I am not here to judge you. You turned on this video. Maybe you're eating a nice lunch, maybe you're procrastinating on something, but you're here to have a nice time, you know? You're here to have a fun time with me. And now I'm just gonna play you a minute of shitty comedy and explain to you why it's offensive? No, I don't think that honors either of our time, and it's also not the sort of thing I'm really interested in.
Already, we have a problem. Joel claims that he isn't here to judge us, and while this video doesn't make direct judgments, the judgments of conservatives have already been agreed upon between Joel and his audience. Conservatives are dumb and stupid, which leads them to do immoral things like punch down and hate minorities, so their art is bad and lame. So no, Joel isn't here to judge anyone, he's just here to justify the judgments he and his audience have already come to. It's a terribly deceptive way of framing his video, and it's not the only instance of deception. Here he goes over some of the questions he wants to answer with his video.
What exactly is conservative comedy? What is at stake in this genre? What does it mean to its intended audience? And what does it mean to me?
I think these are good questions for the video topic, although after watching the video several times, I don't think he does a very good job answering them. Some of the examples of conservative comedy I think he handles well. I thought the JP Sears segment was interesting, and the inclusion of ladyballers felt appropriate. Others, however, make the entire video much more difficult to take seriously. With the inclusion of some of these examples, the questions, what is conservative comedy? What's at stake? What does it mean to its audience? Become more difficult to answer, not easier. Let's start with the worst one, Big Joel's political analysis of Doug Walker's The Wall. Doug Walker, better known as the Nostalgia Critic, has had a mixed legacy that ultimately landed on a sour note. He was one of the key figures to popularize online reviews and critique of various media, along with the Angry Video Game Nerd and others. Many people cite his third movie, and I'm using the term movie loosely here, titled To Boldly Flee, as the definitive point where Doug Walker started to fall off. He wanted to be more than just a critic, but a director himself. He wound up biting off more than he could chew, and his videos got more cringe, more out of touch, and far less passionate. I'm skipping over a lot, but this all culminated in a stupefying piece of media, a parody of Pink Floyd's The Wall. That description alone should be enough to tell you what kind of atrocity we're dealing with. A rock opera parody made by Doug Walker, long after his career took a significant downturn, no less. But we're talking about a video called Conservative Comedy Destroyed My Life. There are many things to criticize Doug Walker's The Wall for, but including it in a video about conservative comedy just feels gross.
It's easy for these conversations to be bogged down in questions of who is and is not a conservative. I don't like conservatism, obviously, and so it's easy for my use of the word to feel like an insult. But the thing is, if we want to have a productive talk about this, we actually have to move past that stigma.
This is how Joel prefaces his analysis of both Doug Walker's The Wall and Team America. Joel and his audience aren't here to move past any sort of stigma, though, and his segment here illustrates that quite well.
My purpose in the following examples is not to tell you this is a bad person, or even this is a wholly conservative person. I don't care about litigating anyone's identity, not really. All I care about is the jokes.
This is a lie. It's a lie within the context of this segment, it's a lie within the context of the rest of his video, and it's a lie within the context of his entire YouTube channel. He does care about litigating people's political political identity, and it's something that happens all of the time on his channel. In fact, it makes sense for him to care about it, considering his analysis is so often political. It makes sense that he would want to try and identify the political leanings and intentions of the people who make the art he analyzes. So why bother including this line about not caring about litigating political identity at all? Because it doesn't make sense to include the Nostalgia Critic in a video about conservative comedy, and I think he's aware of that. The reason why this is a lie in the context of this segment is because he does wind up trying to litigate Doug Walker's political identity.
So obviously, Doug Walker is not some die-hard conservative. In fact, I looked up Nostalgia Critic politics on Google, and the only thing I could find was one Facebook post from 2013. Anyway, yeah, he just seems like kind of a milquetoast centrist liberal type, and that's fine, that's his prerogative. But when you watch his wall video, I don't think it's hard to see a reactionary tendency.
It is a pretty surface level attempt, though he cared enough about it to look into it at all and still included it in his video. More importantly, Joel winds up calling Doug Walker a fascist in an incredibly backhanded fashion. Unfortunately, we need some context from The Wall, both the original and Doug's parody, to understand what Joel is doing here. I'll try to be as brief as possible. Pink Floyd's The Wall was an album that was adapted into a rock opera movie with animated elements. It tells a story about Pink, a rock star whose father died in World War II. The bricks in the wall represent different difficult and traumatic experiences, like being mistreated at school and being cheated on by his wife. The bricks eventually become plentiful enough to make a mental wall, closing off the outside world. This leads to a hallucination where Pink sees himself as a fascist dictator, obviously referencing World War II. He comes to on the floor of a bathroom stall, yelling "stop." In Doug Walker's parody, the scene with Pink hallucinating is replaced with a ham-fisted take on cancel culture. I think there's plenty to be said about the current state of public persecution, but a parody of The Wall probably isn't the best way to explore such a topic. This is the part of the parody that Joel has the biggest gripe with.
This was dissing Thatcher's administration. But it's vague enough to put anyone you fear. Politician, showman, just put their face here.
Doug begins his song with these words, but simply put, that doesn't make any sense. It is borderline incomprehensible. No, when you listen to In the Flesh, you can't just substitute the evil dictator guy for any politician or showman that you don't like. He's pretty explicitly a send-up of right-wing authoritarians. It's like pretty intense and on the nose, honestly.
And that one looks Jewish.
But it isn't explicit or on the nose in the context of The Wall. It's a hallucination, a symbol of Pink's mental anguish and frustration with society. This may seem like a minor thing to point out, yet it's an important piece of the puzzle. Next, Joel talks about the Nostalgia Critic's experience with cancel culture.
It's about Doug and the things that Doug wants to say. Around 2 years before this Wall video was released, a number of Doug Walker's former employees made a document about their experience working for his online media company, Channel Awesome. News of the document quickly spread online, and people began using the hashtag #ChangeTheChannel. You cannot help but think of the hashtag that changed Doug's life. Think of the Critic and the people who hate him on the internet.
As sloppy or as tasteless as Doug's presentation may be, it makes sense for him to express his feelings about cancel culture, public persecution, and hashtags through his parody. If The Wall used fascist and authoritarian themes to symbolize isolation and frustration, then it makes sense for Doug to do the same. Once again, I think the way he handled it was pretty damn bad, but it doesn't tell us anything about the political messaging of Doug or his parody. With the way Joel talks about not labeling people as conservative and not litigating people's political identity, you might think this segment ends here, but this is a video about conservative comedy, and leaving things like this just doesn't make sense, not in the context of the rest of the video. So Joel cranks it up a few notches.
The through line here genuinely is an irrepressible emotional identification with power and a refusal to engage with anything that challenges that power, challenges him. Doug looks at a film about a who screams about murdering Jews and says, "That guy's just like me. I'm gonna make a whole song about how much I love that guy."
Was this really necessary? Was it necessary for Joel to misrepresent The Wall as a film about a fascist screaming about murdering Jews? Was it necessary to represent Doug's interpretation in the least charitable way possible and call him a lover of fascists? Was it necessary for Joel to claim he doesn't care about litigating political identities, only to label Doug first as a centrist liberal and then as someone who identifies with right-wing authoritarians? Was it necessary to take a rock opera parody made by Doug Walker this seriously? To to include the nostalgia critic of all people in a video essay about conservative comedy? For Joel's purposes, I would say yes, this was all necessary. Then what does all of this accomplish? Keep in mind, I'm operating under the assumption this isn't just an instance of Joel being incompetent. He's been writing essays about media, politics, and influence successfully for years. He is no novice. No matter how many times Joel says, I'm not calling Doug Walker a conservative, it doesn't change the fact that he still tried to make the case. This is the closest he can get to labeling someone or something as conservative while actively saying he's not labeling them as conservative. This video isn't a deep political analysis like he implies. It's a call to analyze all comedy and art as inherently political. It's validation for those in his audience who can't help but make every situation about politics.
I'm interested in this stuff because comedy is politics, shares a shape with politics. Comedy, in many cases, is about the formation of in-groups, about who gets to decide what reality is, about which perspectives are legitimate and which are illegitimate.
I understand the point he's making here, but it's far from the whole story. First, comedy isn't politics, period. If any self-respecting comedian heard that, they'd be nauseated. Comedy is, wait for it, comedy. The point of the art form is to make people laugh. Sure, comedy often plays off of social norms, and it can be influential, but Big Joel makes it sound like comedy is the absolute highest order of society and politics when it's merely one aspect of culture. Friend groups can form around music, sports, art, computers, video games, a passion for a certain class, aspects of personality that don't have to do with your sense of humor, etc. Comedy isn't everything, and the same goes for politics. His assessment here would have been more sensical if he spent more time talking about people like Gavin, Crowder, or even Alex Stein. But with the inclusion of the nostalgia critic, Team America, and Ricky Gervais, the line "comedy is politics" is just way too heavy-handed. Joel addresses certain criticisms he's been receiving about this video on his second channel.
The second kind of mean comment is about my inclusion of Doug Walker, the nostalgia critic. A lot of people on Twitter talk about my video as though I call Doug Walker like an intense conservative, which is very strange because I definitely don't do that and actually go out of my way multiple times to emphasize that I'm not doing that.
The problem is Joel did do that in a way and tried to say he wasn't. He was saying one thing and doing another. Just because someone says, I'm not doing that, doesn't mean they're not doing that. He could have found any other way to take issue with Doug's portrayal of cancel culture, but if he didn't find a backhanded way to call Doug Walker and his parody conservative or fascist or reactionary, then he no longer has an excuse to include Doug's parody in his video. The inclusion of the wall is an important one to Joel and his cause, one that gives him and his audience free rein to use even the most vague or non-existent conservative themes in media as ammunition for the culture war. In the case of Team America, Joel's analysis isn't quite as bad as it was for the nostalgia critic, but we still run into some pretty significant issues. His main arguments have to do with the second half of the movie, particularly the ending.
My interest in Team America, at least for the purposes of this video, is less about the puppets and more about the things they do. Conservative pro-Iraq war advocacy. But it is still ultimately a neoconservative movie. I mean, the resolution of the whole thing, the big moral, is that we need those dicks, that the American military is, at base, a necessary and positive force for global peace, and that the libs should learn when to get out of the way.
Unfortunately, I can't show the ending of Team America without censoring it to hell and back. If you haven't seen it, it's still worth watching, but yes, the ending is a crude, over-the-top speech about the importance of both our military and those who criticize our foreign policy. Joel then spends some time explaining why the end is meant to be taken seriously with 4 different points. Matt Stone and Trey Parker have made this point before in South Park. The moral in their material is usually played straight. In interviews, they lightheartedly agree with the ending speech of Team America and the ending itself. I think he makes a decent defense of his argument, but this position in general has 2 fundamental flaws. First, while Trey Parker and Matt Stone may have some conservative leanings and seem to agree with the speech at the end of Team America, it's still a stretch to call the movie pro-war advocacy. Matt and Trey have an extensive background in theater, television, and writing. A lot of their material is about politics, but entertainment and humor are clearly the priority, not to get recruitment numbers up. In fact, I would say a lot of their political material is to make a complete complete mockery of politics and the way we interact with them, not to influence people to become more political. In the context of the whole movie, the end speech of Team America is just something the main character, Gary, was told in a bar by a drunk. It wasn't about the war at first, it was a drunken ramble Gary hears right before getting violently ill for comedic effect. With that in mind, I don't think the audience is meant to take the end speech to heart, even if it's a sentiment that Trey Parker and Matt Stone can get behind. In Team America, comedy isn't politics. Politics is the comedy. The absurd and violent nature of war was something for Matt Stone and Trey Parker to satirize. It's not an attempt to use comedy as some sort of vehicle for recruiting their audience to a conservative cause. It isn't a piece of neoconservative propaganda. It's designed to make light of a serious situation. It's a political satire and action movie parody, not a manifesto. Second, if Matt and Trey have some conservative beliefs which managed to find their way into a movie which also spent plenty of time mocking the American military, what exactly is the problem? According to Joel, this would be a genuine creative expression of two artists who happen to be closer to the political center than him. It's not a grift, it doesn't pander, and to Joel, that's the problem.
After the first 30 minutes, though, the movie completely changes. Like, Team America blows up Cairo, and that's bad, but then they never actually do another bad thing. That conclusion is not what brought the funny, what brought the joy. On a basic level, the more conservative stuff is a lot less memorable. Here's the problem with this tone shift, though. I don't buy it. The way the movie argues for America is less impactful and less funny than the way it argues against America. Like, we have this whole thing with the celebrities, right? How stupid and phony and effeminate they are. And it's like, okay, whatever, celebrity's dumb, that's a fine thing to say, but also, who cares? But it's not funny like the first 30 minutes are.
Joel is able to get completely behind the anti-military jokes, but when the humor is pointed against anything remotely left-leaning, he no longer buys it. The problem Joel is experiencing isn't that Team America is overly conservative. The real problem is that he's too dug into leftist politics to be able to enjoy the whole movie. Even when it's clear that satire, mockery, and parody come long before any kind of political agenda, Joel is still upset when his politics become the subject of teasing. He isn't able to take the joke. For him, it would have been a better movie if Matt and Trey would have catered to his own political beliefs instead of expressing themselves in an honest and unrestrained manner. He wants to be pandered to. He wants people to put influence before expression, but only if it's for a leftist cause and nothing else. He wants to change the way people think about expressing themselves and the way people interpret those expressions.
These arguments whittle away at our ability to interact with media as media. As a video essayist, I generally act as if there's a way of interpreting media properly, because people like these use arguments like the ones we've talked about to try to control your mind. In fact, I basically do think there's correct and incorrect ways of interpreting media and try to interpret it correctly. They are alienating you from one of the most fundamental things about being a human: your ability to understand and interpret art as a person who lives in our culture. I mean, that should be my job, right?
I don't believe it should be anyone's job to tell us the right and wrong ways of looking at art. If you want to review, criticize, or analyze something, that's good, but your goal shouldn't be to constrict the public's interpretations in order to favor a political party. The goal should be to share your interpretation, to simply add to the public discourse, not to hijack public discourse or to gain power over that media or to misrepresent it for some kind of personal gain. Someone defending Joel might counter this by saying, well, isn't that what you're doing, over-politicizing Joel's work for some kind of cause? There's a difference between turning media like Doug Walker's The Wall into political ammunition and saying there's a problem with that approach. There's a time and a place for political analysis, and if you can't recognize that, you're probably going to make matters worse. Looking at things solely from a political perspective is not the answer to all of our problems. It's a problem in itself. Joel's content is explicitly leftist and often deceptive. He is whittling away at his audience's ability to interact with media as media. The difference with Joel is that we know it's intentional. His content is too politically explicit and deceptive for him to argue otherwise.
And I worry that this narrative of radicalization toward the right followed by de-radicalization kind of causes us to not just be able to sit with the fact that in our past, when we were teenagers, we were just cringe little guys. You were just a cringe guy who liked cringy content and made edgelord jokes and sucked ass. You hated yourself, everyone hated you, and you hated yourself. You were lame and everyone hated you. And that's the truth. Because you sucked. Because you sucked then. I am genuinely happy and moved when I see people developing politically in certain ways because of things I say. And again, I'm not trying to shame anybody in my audience.
But that's exactly what he just did. He's using shame to try and push people in a specific ideological direction. He's saying one thing and doing another. Even if I did think it was necessary to have someone tell us the correct and incorrect ways of interpreting media, Joel would not be the man for the job. He's far too invested in his own political identity to make an accurate and fair assessment of the majority of art. Defending leftism and attacking conservatives will always come first for him, no matter how he tries to say otherwise. In this next clip, he's talking about Anita and Gamergate again.
They don't criticize Anita Sarkeesian's work because she explicitly calls for immoral actions. All she does is give her opinions about media, right?
All she does is give her opinions on media, right? No, because Joel recognizes that Anita isn't just giving an opinion. She's trying to change the direction of an entire medium of art for political reasons. That opinion has a very specific purpose: to try and shame an industry and its consumers to move in a direction that's more to her liking.
For around 4 months on Big Joel, I was making videos that were pretty unpopular, but were like really from the heart. Like I really cared about the videos and I was passionate about them. And they did pretty poorly. And then just recently, I made a video that was really successful, PragerU for Kids, and I really enjoyed making it. But it wasn't like it was a deep project for me. I didn't care that much about making it. So it's better to make popular art. It makes you feel better. It makes you happier. People always say, like, make the art that you're passionate about. Make the art that you care the most about. Fuck, no. Absolutely terrible advice for your mental health. Really could not disagree more. If you want to feel really good, sell out. Thank you so much for your time. I hope that you take this advice to heart. I do mean it, by the way. I feel much better having made a popular video than I ever did making 3 or 4 artsy unpopular videos.
To Joel, art is more about its influence and popularity than it is about honest expression. Sure, he makes some less politically charged videos here and there, but he understands that his most popular and influential content is the anti-conservative, anti-traditionalist, pro-leftism material. It's bad enough that we have a social media environment that encourages people to sell out and focus on nothing but numbers, popularity, and money. That's how we wind up with the Neons and Jack Dohertys of the world. It gets a lot worse when that message is mixed with politics. So what kind of behavior might Joel be cultivating? Since he wants his audience to focus on popularity and influence over expression, since he wants his audience to interpret media in the overly political way he does, since he wants his audience to be concerned with the messaging in something as harmless as Doug Walker's The Wall, and since he's willing to lie to achieve these ends, I would say he's cultivating anxiety, neuroticism, political fanaticism, a dishonest approach to making and consuming art, and most importantly for Joel, he's cultivating an audience that's willing to weaponize any piece of media for the sake of leftism. He's cultivating manipulation through manipulation. He's enabling indignation and resignation. This is what's at stake for Joel. To quote Beyond Good and Evil, there is too much sugar and sorcery in those feelings of for others, of not for me, for one not to become doubly distrustful here and to ask, are they not perhaps seductions, that they give pleasure to him who has them and to him who enjoys their fruits, also to the mere spectator, does not yet furnish an argument in their favor but urges us to caution. So let us be cautious. Alright, what about me? Surely there's some kind of agenda behind what I'm saying, otherwise I wouldn't have spent all of this time making my case. As Joel and many others call for people to get more emotionally invested into politics, I say it's probably best if we establish some emotional distance from political discourse. So yes, I'm trying to make a point with this video. I could continue to defend my approach over Joel's because they are different, although any attempt to defend myself further here is only a greater assertion. When all is said and done, Joel and I are just two people seeking power. The only responsible prescription I can make here is to not give someone like Joel or myself any kind of control over your own interpretations. Your perspective is the most individual, unique, and honest part of yourself. Do not let yourself be swayed so easily. You are in control. Alright, that's gonna have to do it for this one. Shout out to the best subscriber squad in all of YouTube. I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
there's something horrifying about that feeling that there is no truth, that people will just contort reality any way they like. But at the same time, it's kind of fun.